Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Last week, Ukraine and the United States agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, but Russia remains hesitant. President Putin has stated he agrees in principle, but insists on further negotiations. At the same time, President Trump has urged Putin to spare Ukrainian forces while warning of potential economic measures if Russia does not comply. The two are expected to hold phone talks on March 18th to discuss the matter. Now, beyond the battlefield, the G7 has issued a statement calling for Russia's full commitment to the ceasefire, and discussions in Paris are now focused on forming a post-war peacekeeping force with NATO allies participating, but not the U.S. For a deeper analysis to this, we are joined by Professor Mason Rishi, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, here in the studio with us. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us online is Hanna Kim, Assistant Professor at Seogang University GSIS. Great to have you, Professor.
Thanks for having me also.
So let's start with Professor Rishi. So last week, like I said, the U.S. and Ukraine agreed to suspend combat operations with Russia for 30 days. Putin says we need further negotiations, however. So what's Russia's intention behind making a decision swiftly? Not making a decision swiftly, excuse me.
Yeah, so I think Putin has a number of things that he wants to accomplish by delaying this or drawing this process out. The first, of course, is rhetorically, Putin's made the statement on several occasions, as have his spokespeople and foreign minister and his advisors, that Russia's seeking a true peace deal and not just a ceasefire. There's attempt to sort of get the rhetorical high ground. As much as anything else, probably for international messaging, perhaps also for domestic messaging. In the second place, I think obviously Putin doesn't want to appear eager to negotiate. I think he wants to send the message that Russia is in a strong position in Ukraine and that their battlefield success sets them up for being able to drive a very hard bargain in whatever negotiations are to be entered into. And so, I think he wants to make very clear that he's not going to give away what he thinks have been the battlefield victories that Russia has gained. So I think that's part of it. And then thirdly, I do think there may also be an aspect of trying to delay this in order to consolidate Russia's battlefield position, especially perhaps in the Kursk region, where things are very fragile for Ukraine. And Russia seems to have made some ground up in a counterattack and pushing Ukraine into a very difficult position. So Putin may be trying to sort of consolidate that position and make it easier, essentially, perhaps before the ceasefire, to drive the soldiers on the Ukrainian side out of Russia, which would strengthen also, by default, Russia's hand in the negotiations going forward.
So with Russia yet to make a decision, last week, U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, Stephen Witkoff, visited Russia to discuss a 30-day ceasefire proposal. And it's reported that Putin conveyed a message to President Trump through this person. So, Professor Kim, what could Russia's demands be?
Okay, so President Putin's messages seem to be indicating several demands. The first may be Ukraine's neutrality and NATO's non-alignment. Putin has maintained this long-standing position that a ceasefire must lead to the elimination of the root causes of the war, which he believes includes NATO's withdrawal from Eastern Europe, Ukraine formally renouncing its aspirations to join NATO, and Ukraine adopting a neutral stance on its foreign policy. But another demand has to do with territorial concessions. Putin has continuously demanded that Ukraine recognize Russian sovereignty over several annexed territories. And another demand may have to do with military limitations. Putin wants the complete disarmament of Ukraine, and he has called for the reduction in Ukraine's military capabilities, including limitations on troop deployment and restrictions on the import of weapons. This has led to him requesting a halt to Western arms supplies to Ukraine as well. So all of these would put Ukraine in a even greater military disadvantage, making it difficult for Zelensky to accept these demands. But it seems as though Putin is using this as a strategy to avoid outright rejection of U.S. ceasefire proposals while also setting the conditions that are a little bit more favorable to Russia.
Right. So with this situation, the day after Ukraine and the U.S. reached the ceasefire, Putin visited the Kursk region, which is a very important location in the Ukraine war, and he wore a military uniform. Professor Kim, what message is he trying to send with this move?
I think he's trying to send several messages here. One has to do with demonstrating military resolve. Putin wearing this military attire alongside top commanders, it projects this very strongman leadership image, and it shows this commitment to Russia's military objective. And this visual reinforces his dedication to achieving his strategic goals, particularly in contested regions like Kursk. Another may have to do with influencing ceasefire negotiations. The visit took place not long after Ukraine and the U.S. agreed on this 30-day ceasefire proposal. So Putin's presence in Kursk really emphasizes Russia's leverage in these negotiations and signals that any ceasefire terms must account for Russia's recent territorial gains and military stance. Another has to do with boosting domestic morale. Putin engaging directly with the troops there serves to boost the morale of the Russian forces, and it can also foster a bit of nationalistic spirits. And he may also be sending a message to the international observers as well. The timing and nature of the visit really conveys to the global world that Russia remains resolute and unyielding, as Professor Ritchie mentioned earlier as well. So in many ways, it's kind of showing that Russia's continued to maintain or continue its military campaigns if its strategic interests are not adequately addressed in any forthcoming agreements.
Right. And as part of efforts to push through with the ceasefire, President Trump has publicly urged Putin to spare the lives of Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Kursk. But Putin said surrender as a precondition to this. How do you assess the standoff between the two nations, Professor Rishi?
Yeah, well, just with respect to the Kursk region, as I mentioned earlier, I think the situation for the Ukrainians there is increasingly dire. We have battlefield reports that are difficult to come by because access there is extremely hazardous, of course, and in fact, from the Russian side, essentially impossible, and the Ukrainian side also has essentially prohibited journalists, from going there. So, independent reports are hard to come by, but there have been recent reports from soldiers on the ground there who have said that, on the Ukrainian side, who've said that the road leading out of Kursk back into Ukrainian territory, the one that was more or less freely travelable as of even several weeks ago, has become increasingly hazardous, notably, of course, by drone strikes. And so the situation there has become extremely difficult for the soldiers. In the first place, if they're trying to leave to retreat, which may well be the case in terms of what it is that Zelensky's trying to do. He's trying to perhaps pull those soldiers out because their situation is so dire. And part of the reason why the situation is so dire is not only because the Russians have somewhere between, we think, 50 and 60,000 troops massed around those troops, Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region, but also because the logistics and supply lines to support those Ukrainian troops have become extremely difficult. So the situation is, I think, really difficult in terms of the standoff in the Kursk region. Zelensky probably wanted to send troops into that region originally in order to grab some territory from Russia, to have a bargaining chip if and when negotiations were to start. It would be very difficult for Putin to negotiate anything that didn't involve, obviously Russia walking out of this war with all of the territory under its control that it had when it went into it. But it's looking increasingly difficult, I think, to imagine that Zelensky is going to be able to have that bargaining chip in his pocket, even when we reach a ceasefire, much less the actual negotiations phase. Within the larger scope of things, of course, the front lines are in many cases within Europe, within Ukraine, the territory itself of Ukraine, more or less hardened. Each side makes some gains in attack and counterattack. In the short term, really Ukraine's in a very difficult position, both in terms of materiel, but also in terms of manpower. Russia is in a stronger position simply because the war of attrition that this has turned into ultimately favors Russia simply because of its 4-to-1 population size advantage and the advantage that it has in fires. And that's really making the difference. So it's a very difficult situation for Ukraine, especially since it's, of course, ultimately, in some sense, dependent on the assistance from the United States, both financially in terms of military, materiel and intelligence, and to a lesser degree, Europe. But Europe, simply has some restrictions and some bottlenecks on what it can provide compared to the U.S.
Mm-hmm. But President Trump has been urging, Putin to, help go join the ceasefire, free Ukrainian soldiers. What about the standoff between Trump and Putin?
In that sense, I think it's hard to say if the White House was surprised that Putin didn't more quickly accept the ceasefire. I think that if they were surprised, they probably weren't paying very close attention to the way that that Putin acts. And judging by how quickly the Trump administration responded, notably by turning the tap back on for intelligence sharing with Ukraine and agreeing to begin assisting Ukraine militarily, as well as threatening Russia with economic sanctions, I think that the Trump administration may well have been prepared for Putin to say no. And they're, I think, trying to turn the screws a little bit on Moscow to finally get this over the line, because it does seem like this is something where where Trump has invested quite a bit of personal capital here, and I think that we're going to see the result of what happens with this conversation scheduled for Tuesday the 18th, and one imagines that Trump is going to walk away from it, probably trying to make the argument that he's managed to finally push this over the line, or at least get Putin closer to accepting a ceasefire agreement.
Right, so we'll have to wait just some more day for that. But President Trump has previously warned that if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire, economic measures could be imposed. Professor Kim, what pressure tactics can the U.S. use to push Putin towards accepting the ceasefire?
Yes, I think Professor Ritchie also mentioned some of these potential strategies as well, but this can also include, sanctions on countries that are importing Russian oil and gas. So the U.S. could impose secondary sanctions on countries that purchase Russian energy resources, which would then deter countries from engaging with Russia in terms of energy trade and reduce Russia's oil and gas revenues. It could also, the U.S. could also strengthen existing sanctions. So it could enhance current sanctions to further restrict Russia's access to international financial systems and critical technologies, which would limit Russia's ability to sustain its military operations. Another would be increasing military support for Ukraine. The U.S. has agreed to restore military assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine if a ceasefire is established. So this support could expand to include more advanced weaponry and training, which would strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities. And also, the U.S. could also help in terms of creating more diplomatic isolation for Russia. So coordinating with allies to diplomatically isolate Russia on the international platforms could also pressure Russia and highlight its diminishing global support as well.
Right, so he could strengthen sanctions. He could also help Ukraine more in terms of military support. But we hear that President Trump has announced that he will hold a phone call with President Putin on the 18th, like our Professor Rishi has mentioned, to discuss possible peace agreements. Given the ongoing tensions between the two sides, could this leader-to-leader conversation lead to a breakthrough in negotiations?
And so this phone call that's happening on the 18th actually is following a previous conversation that took place on February 12th, earlier this year, where they agreed to commence negotiations to end the conflict. So in that sense, this upcoming phone call can be a significant step in attempting to resolve the conflict. President Trump has also expressed optimism regarding this, about the potential to end the war, stating that discussions on certain issues such as territorial divisions and power plants are already underway between Russia and Ukraine. But the chances of an actual breakthrough, I think, remains still quite uncertain due to several factors. This includes, Russia's going to maintain its stance on the importance of territory exchanges and its refusal to accept the ceasefire. It hasn't budged in this regard at all. Also, Putin continues to insist on excluding Ukraine from NATO, and these demands will continue to complicate negotiations. But in addition to this, both nations still have opposing views on how to resolve the conflict. And the West continues to support Ukraine's sovereignty while Russia continues to maintain its territorial claims. So a phone call between the two leaders is a positive step, and it can open the door for dialogue, but substantial progress and achieving a breakthrough would require significant compromises and the alignment of various interests of various countries. So this is going to take a lot more time to achieve.
Right. So, but it could be a stepping stone for further, negotiations between the two sides. Now, right. Now, Professor Kim has touched upon a while ago that giving further support for Ukraine could be a measure that could be done by President Trump. And we are aware that U.S. decided to immediately resume military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. Now, given that the war itself actually currently favors Russia. Professor, how much military support is the U.S. expected to provide to Ukraine?
Well, at least in the short term, in the context of where the conflict is now and where the Trump administration would like to see it go, which is to essentially be wound down, I think Ukraine can only expect to see as much military assistance, whether that be material or financial assistance or intelligence assistance, that would sufficiently push Putin to come to the negotiating table. I don't think that the Trump administration is going to turn the tap on for military assistance sufficiently to help Ukraine establish a much better position over the short term in terms of negotiating. I think largely Trump has decided that where things are now in terms of negotiating is where it's going to begin. I don't think that he's going to try to support Ukraine in order to create, as we say, facts on the ground to make things easier for Ukraine in the negotiations. So in that sense, I think you have to be relatively pessimistic. In the medium and long term, the degree to which the United States be willing to support Ukraine, I think is still uncertain. At least at some point, we've seen Trump be quite negative about the U.S. role in providing security guarantees, future military assistance, and other forms of support for Ukraine within the context of the negotiations. But he might have been making a relatively harsh set of claims vis-a-vis Zelensky in order to prod him to come to the table. And in fact, the package that he might be willing to offer Ukraine in terms of assistance within the context of a longer term, hopefully durable peace deal, might be bigger than at least appears on paper currently.
Mm-hmm. But elsewhere now, at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada, they adopted a joint statement urging Russia to agree to and fully implement the ceasefire. And there had been initial concerns about differences in reaching this agreement. What's the significance of this joint statement, Professor?
Yeah, it's a pretty solid statement, actually. It was more robust in its support of Ukraine and less tolerant of the obvious fabrications by Russia, and sort of notably absent was this U.S. acceptance of Russia's claims, and notably absent was this White House set of talking points at various points that Zelensky and Ukraine was somehow the aggressor in the story, or at least that it wasn't the victim. And so this G7 statement clearly acknowledged that Russia was the aggressor, and that it was time for Russia to meet its obligations to Ukraine and to the international community. And I think that reflects in the first place probably an attempt by the traditionalists in the White House, notably Rubio and others in the foreign policy establishment, to perhaps get on the right side of the story. I think it was probably also a way to sort of mend fences with Zelensky after that disastrous White House public meeting, for which Zelensky apologized afterwards as well. And I think it also, of course, represents the fact that the United States and the other European countries are trying to pressure Putin, and that was a rhetorical device in order to do so.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ukraine and the U.S. have agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, an international conference on the establishment of a peacekeeping force for post-war Ukraine was also held in Paris now. Most NATO allies, excluding the U.S., participated in the meeting. Professor Kim, what are the key challenges and prospects for the creation of such a peacekeeping force?
Right, so as you mentioned, European leaders gathered in Paris to accelerate discussions on this coalition of the willing, but there are still several challenges. One key issue is U.S. security guarantees and military support. U.S. needs essential air support, intelligence, and logistical assistance from the U.S. for this peacekeeping mission, but the Trump administration has remained relatively reluctant in committing militarily. The U.S. didn't participate in this meeting, as you mentioned, and, without American military backing, peacekeepers could lack the deterrence power necessary to prevent further Russian aggression. So this has been described as the chicken or egg dilemma. Europe is waiting for U.S. security assurances, while Trump is waiting to see if Europe is willing to act or take a decisive action first. And another hurdle comes from the lack of consensus among European nations. So the UK and France are providing support by deploying troops, but concrete commitments remain uncertain. And most other nations have also provided only logistical support. Poland is providing logistical assistance, but no ground troops. Norway is willing to contribute, but there are no specific commitments. And Italy, Germany, and Spain remain hesitant about sending troops. And the list goes on and on and on. But this divided stance among these countries is weakening Europe's ability to form a united peacekeeping force, and this is undermining credibility. And on top of this, there is the temporary nature of the ceasefire. Since this is a 30-day ceasefire, it's temporary, and so the long-term success of this remains relatively uncertain. And establishing a force without clear enforcement mechanisms could turn it into more of a symbolic gesture rather than an effective one. So there are a lot of these challenges, including, Russia opposing this entire situation. But despite these challenges, forming a peacekeeping force is not impossible. It would still require some clear rules of engagement, possibly a larger multinational coalition, more financial and logistical backing from other countries such as the United States, and diplomatic pressures. All of these things could help in terms of keeping this peacekeeping force.
So with diplomatic negotiations, military maneuvers, and geopolitical pressures all in play, the coming days will be crucial to determine whether a lasting agreement can be reached. And we will continue to monitor the developments and provide further analysis on what's next for Ukraine. But as for now, we'll have to wrap up our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Rishi.
Thank you for the invitation.
And Professor Kim as well. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me again.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.